On May 31st, 2009, in Austin, Texas, the lives of two families would be changed forever. Areli Escobar and Bianca Maldonado Hernandez lived in the same apartment complex on Decker Lane, just 100 yards apart. Areli lived with his sisters, Nancy and Lydia, and his nieces and nephews at his apartment. Bianca, only 17 years old at the time, lived with her mother Jacqueline, her sister Dania, and her infant son Caesar. That morning, at around 3 a.m., Jacqueline and Dania left for their newspaper delivery job, locking the door behind them, as was their usual routine. They left Bianca and her baby, Caesar, alone in the apartment. Bianca was awake, nursing her son when they left, and less than 4 hours later, Jacqueline and Dania returned home. After unlocking the door, the two women entered the apartment, and Jacqueline immediately noticed that something was terribly wrong. The living room was in disarray. Furniture cushions were scattered around, and blood was covering the walls and carpet. In the center of the room, Jacqueline found Bianca, lying face down on the floor. When she touched Bianca's back, she felt that her daughter's body was cold. Caesar was next to Bianca and was covered in blood. He was alive, though motionless. Jacqueline quickly handed Caesar to Dania and called 911 for help. Emergency medical services paramedics Eric Chandler and Eric Lancaster arrived shortly after. They found Dania outside the apartment with Caesar and began assessing his injuries in the ambulance. Inside the apartment, paramedic Eric Chandler confirmed that Bianca had no pulse. Her body was cold and stiff, and there were clear signs of violent trauma. Detective David Fugit of the Austin Police Department arrived on the scene around 8:20 a.m. He found Bianca's body face down in the living room. Her hair was matted with blood, and she was covered in blood and nearly naked with only her blood-soaked bra, which was fastened in the back but has been adjusted to expose her breasts. Her legs were spread, and there appeared to be a handprint on her buttock. The condition of her body indicated that she had suffered severe physical abuse. Bianca was sexually assaulted with an unknown object, which was never recovered, and she had numerous stab wounds, including several to her face and head. It appeared that she had been attacked with a sharp object, possibly a knife, and her body showed signs of defensive wounds on her hands and arms. Her scalp had been severely damaged, and there were injuries to her back and buttocks. Further examination revealed more stab wounds across her face, head, left breast, and right shoulder, and it seemed like there was bruising to her eyes, nose, and lips. There was no evidence of forced entry into the apartment, and no eyewitnesses to the crime. Shortly before Jacqueline and Dania left for their newspaper delivery job, Areli was with his then-girlfriend, Zoe Moreno, at his apartment, and they planned on spending the night together. Around 2:15 a.m., Zoe arrived at Areli's apartment, where she briefly spoke with him, his sister Nancy, and Nancy's boyfriend, Miguel de Paz Aguirre. Afterward, Zoe took a shower. She recalled that Areli was dressed in jeans, a short-sleeved shirt, and black, zippered polo shoes, and at that moment he appeared uninjured. There were no cuts, scratches, or bruises on his face or body. At nearly the same time Jacqueline and Dania were heading out for their newspaper route, Areli's sister Lydia left the apartment to drive a friend home. Areli walked outside with Lydia and her friend, but then stayed outside while they left the complex. According to Zoe, after she finished her shower, she realized that Areli hadn't returned to the apartment. Feeling upset, she decided that she would pack her overnight bag and drive home in her car. On her way out of the apartment complex, Zoe noticed that Areli's Lincoln Navigator was still parked in the parking lot, leading her to believe that he left the apartment on foot. While driving home, Zoe attempted to call Areli several times. She placed 2 calls at 4:04 a.m. and a third at 4:12 a.m. The first 3 calls went unanswered, but around 4:15 a.m. one of her calls connected and stayed on the line for about 10 minutes and 24 seconds. In the first few minutes of the call, Zoe said that she could hear a woman screaming nonstop. She then heard moans and grunts mixed with the screaming, and at that point Zoe assumed Areli was having sex with someone. Phone records later indicated that the call from Zoe's phone to Areli's phone connected to a nearby cell tower close to the apartment complex where the murder took place. At 5:11 a.m., Zoe sent a text message to Areli's sister Nancy, telling her that she had called Areli and overheard him having sex with another woman. At nearly the same time, between 5 and 5:30 a.m., Areli drove Nancy's rental car, a tan Mazda Protege, to his mother's apartment to change his clothes. He was injured and had a few blood spots on his clothing, saying that he had been in a fight. He handed his bloody clothes to his mother to wash, but despite trying to wash the clothes twice, the blood wouldn't come out. At 5:26 a.m., Zoe received a text from Nancy's phone, which said that Areli had gone to their mother's apartment to change out of his clothes, which had blood on them after being in a fight, and that he couldn't return home because someone might be looking for him. Upon reading this, Zoe quickly sent a message to her adult son Emilio Lopez at 5:45 a.m., saying, "OMG, I think Areli raped someone." After a couple of hours at his mother's home, Areli drove the same rented Mazda to Miguel's apartment. Areli contacted Miguel around 7 a.m., saying he was on his way. Initially, Miguel said that Areli allegedly told him that he had fucked up some woman, but then changed his story, explaining that he had been in a fight with some asshole. Areli also mentioned that after changing his clothes and leaving his mother's house, he was attacked again, and an eyewitness later testified that he had personally witnessed the fight and broke it up. Before Areli arrived at Miguel's apartment, Miguel sent a text message to Nancy, saying that Areli mentioned that he fucked up and that there was some girl's blood on his clothes. At 12:06 p.m., Zoe sent another text message to Nancy, asking if she had found out what had happened. In her response, Nancy explained that she had spoken to Miguel, who told her that Areli told him that he, quote, "fucked up. The blood was some girl's and not his. My mom already washed his clothes twice, and she still can't get all the blood off. She said his clothes had tons of blood on it. Gosh, I don't know what he did." After spending several hours with Areli, Miguel drove him back to his apartment and dropped him off sometime after 4 p.m. Later that night, Areli claimed that he had sex with a woman earlier that morning. His sister Rosalva then texted him, asking if he had hurt anyone, to which Areli denied. He said, quote, "I just tapped that." The Austin Police Department collected several pieces of evidence at the crime scene, including the shorts Bianca had been wearing, which were on the sofa, with her panties underneath, a blood-stained lotion bottle near the love seat which had a partial fingerprint, a shoe print impression in the carpet next to Bianca's body, and bloodstains throughout the room and near the front door. Bloodstains were visible on both the inside and outside surfaces of the front door, and strands of hair which were matted with blood were found in the front entryway. Based on the evidence, investigators determined that Bianca's struggle began at the front door and continued into the living room, where she ultimately died. Interestingly, the rest of the apartment, including the dining room and 3 bedrooms, appeared undisturbed. However, there was blood transfer at the threshold of the hallway bathroom, and investigators found blood around the bathroom sink. Additionally, a purse was found in the sink with water running from the faucet into it. As the investigation progressed, police received a tip through Crime Stoppers from Areli's girlfriend, Zoe. Detective Carrie Scanlon from the Austin Police Department interviewed Zoe, and she explained what happened that night from her point of view. Based on that information, multiple search warrants were issued. 4 warrants on June 2, 2009, allowed authorities to search Areli's apartment, his mother's home, and to collect DNA samples from him, including buccal swabs, penile swabs, an epithelial sample, scrapings and clippings from Areli's fingernails, and samples of his head and pubic hair. A 5th search warrant on June 4, 2009 permitted the authorities to search the tan Mazda Protege. A 6th warrant issued on June 22, 2009 authorized the seizure of Areli's cell phone. An autopsy of Bianca's body was conducted by Dr. David Dolinek, the Travis County Medical Examiner, on June 1, 2009. Dr. Dolinek noted signs of lividity on the front of Bianca's body, indicating she had been lying face down at the time of her death. Her face showed signs of blunt force injury, likely from punches or kicks, and there was an additional blunt force injury to her scalp. Bianca had sustained 43 stab wounds and 30 cuts, which appeared to have been inflicted by two different sharp objects. One was likely a single-edged knife, at least 3 inches long, and the other was possibly an object with a serrated edge. Bianca was stabbed in her forehead, cheek, lips, left side of her nose, scalp, breasts, and shoulder. She had also been stabbed in the left upper chest, resulting in broken ribs and a punctured lung. One of the stab wounds penetrated her right side, damaging her heart. The injured tissue was bloody, meaning that Bianca was alive when she sustained the injuries. The autopsy also revealed defensive wounds on Bianca's arms and hands, indicating that she fought back against her attacker. These injuries were consistent with her trying to protect herself and grabbing the knife blade 3 or 4 times during the struggle. Additionally, Dr. Dolinak observed severe injuries to Bianca's lower body. Skin had been torn from the top crease of her buttocks down to her lower back, an injury likely caused by forceful spreading of her buttocks. Dr. Dolinak concluded that a large, hard object had been forcibly inserted into her, causing extensive damage to Bianca's vaginal and anal areas. Bianca also had internal injuries, including damage to her bladder, pelvic area, rectum, and reproductive organs, which showed signs of hemorrhaging. This bleeding indicated that Bianca was alive when she sustained these injuries. Dr. Dolinak explained that Bianca's death was likely caused by blood loss from all the stab wounds, and that she likely died within 5 to 10 minutes after suffering her final injury. Affidavits presented to the court contained several details that allegedly connected Areli to the crime, including the fact that Areli and Bianca lived in the same apartment complex, that he left his apartment around the same time Bianca's mother and sister left for their newspaper route, that the timing of the crime aligns with the time Areli left his apartment and the period during which his whereabouts couldn't be accounted for, that Zoe's phone call to Areli's cell phone, where she reportedly heard moaning, grunting, and a woman's screams for 10 minutes, was made around the same time as the crime. That the crime scene itself suggested that the perpetrator would have been covered in blood, as there was a significant amount of it. That after the crime, Areli went to his mother's house in his sister's car, where he had his clothes washed. That when Areli was arrested on June 2, 2009, he had injuries to his face, right hand, and elbow that were consistent with someone involved in a physical struggle around the time of the murder. And that Areli admitted to his sister's boyfriend, Miguel, that he messed up and that the blood on his clothes was from some girl. In 2011, Areli Escobar stood trial for capital murder and was convicted by a jury, ultimately receiving a death sentence. This case was complicated by the fact that there were no eyewitnesses, and most of the evidence against Areli was circumstantial, such as the fact that he had injuries and changed his clothes at his mother's house that morning, and his ex-girlfriend Zoe's testimony, which was unreliable. Zoe told multiple people on the day of the crime that when she called Areli's phone, she heard what sounded like him cheating on her with another woman. In a series of text messages, she described what sounded like consensual sex and expressed how angry she was, and that their relationship was over. However, by the time she testified in court 2 years later, her story had changed. She now claimed that during the phone call, she heard a woman screaming and screaming and screaming and screaming and screaming and just screaming. This inconsistency was pointed out by the defense during the trial. Due to a lot of the evidence being circumstantial, the prosecution relied heavily on forensic evidence during the trial. Half of the case was focused on the testimony of forensic experts who explained how various pieces of evidence fit together like a puzzle to prove Areli's guilt. The evidence was mainly presented by analysts and experts from the Austin Police Department's DNA lab, which is part of their forensic science division. In the world of criminal justice, DNA evidence is often seen as the gold standard when it comes to forensics. It's especially crucial in cases like this one, where there's a stranger-on-stranger crime with no witnesses and little other evidence pointing to a suspect. For jurors, DNA evidence can be incredibly persuasive, making it one of the most important pieces of evidence in a trial. In fact, at least one juror who oversaw Areli's murder trial stated that the DNA evidence was a deciding factor in their vote, meaning that the state would not have been able to obtain a conviction without it. The juror said, quote, I was sitting on the fence, if you will, as to whether he was guilty or not guilty all the way up to when the DNA evidence was submitted to the jury. And for me, that was the sealing factor. Additionally, when expert testimony is introduced in court, it carries a lot of weight. The court essentially vouches for the credibility of the expert, which makes their testimony very trustworthy in the eyes of the jury. During the trial, the jury heard that the APD's DNA lab was an accredited lab, meaning it followed strict procedures based on sound scientific principles. Dr. Mitchell Holland, along with Elizabeth Morris, a senior DNA analyst at the lab, testified to the lab's accreditation. Dr. Holland explained that being accredited meant the lab adhered to standards set by the FBI and the broader forensic science community. Ms. Morris clarified that accreditation also meant an independent agency had reviewed the lab's procedures, techniques, and the qualifications of both the staff and the lab itself. With this accreditation established, the jury was then shown DNA evidence that allegedly linked Areli to the crime. Elizabeth presented findings from DNA samples collected from the clothing Areli's mother had washed, as well as from polo shoes and jeans Areli was wearing. She testified that Bianca's DNA could not be excluded as a possible contributor to these samples. Additionally, the polo shoe had a tread pattern that was similar to an impression left in blood on Bianca's carpet. In addition to this, Marisa Rowe, a forensic expert from Fairfax Identity Laboratories, reviewed the same DNA evidence after it was collected and analyzed by the APD DNA lab. She confirmed that, in her independent examination, Bianca's DNA could not be excluded as a contributor to two separate DNA samples found on Areli's shirt, which were collected by APD and examined by the APD DNA lab, and one more sample from the same shirt which was collected by her. Mixed profile DNA samples are samples that contain DNA from multiple individuals, which can make analysis trickier. Two mixed profile DNA samples were collected by the APD from the Mazda Areli was seen driving on the day of the murder, and Marisa testified that Bianca's DNA could not be excluded as a contributor to these samples. Lastly, APD DNA analyst and serologist Diana Morales testified that the lab couldn't identify Areli's DNA on certain samples taken from the inside door lock of Bianca's apartment. However, Marisa performed further testing on one of the samples after the APD DNA lab had handled it. She then testified that she found that Areli's DNA could not be excluded from one of those samples. The prosecution also called the lead detective, Detective Scanlon, to testify. He explained that based on the analysis by APD's latent print analyst, Sandra Siegel, no latent fingerprints found in Bianca's apartment matched Areli's. Sandra initially excluded Areli from being the source of any prints, and her supervisor verified her findings. However, midway through the trial, she decided to re-examine one print, a low-quality print found on a lotion bottle next to Bianca's body. Upon re-examination, Sandra testified that the latent print and the joint of Areli's left ring finger were a match, and this new conclusion was also confirmed by her supervisor. The state also introduced evidence related to Areli's cell phone. They revealed that around the time of the murder, Areli's phone signal was bouncing off two different cell towers located on opposite sides of the apartment complex where both he and Bianca lived, and according to the prosecution, this was consistent with him being in her apartment at the time of the murder. After the jury found Areli guilty of capital murder and sentenced him to death, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals upheld his conviction on November 20th, 2013, after an automatic direct appeal. He then filed his initial post-conviction application for writ of habeas corpus in May 2013, but the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals denied relief on February 24th, 2016. It wasn't long after his conviction was upheld that it was revealed that the DNA evidence and testimony which was presented during the trial was false, misleading, and unreliable. After Areli's application was rejected, the APD's DNA lab was permanently shut down. This decision followed an investigation that uncovered serious issues within the lab, including systemic errors and significant bias that affected its work. Additionally, the state determined that the lab staff were so unqualified and untrustworthy that they could not be retrained. The lab's practices had been questionable since it even opened, and during closing arguments in the trial, Areli's defense team pointed out the issues with the DNA analysis. But it wasn't until mid to late 2015 that the full extent of these problems came to light. We'll first start by discussing the lab's questionable practices and how they came to light, then go on to explain how these issues severely compromised the DNA evidence in Areli's case. In May of 2015, the FBI made public the fact that there were minor discrepancies in its STR population database, which had been used by many forensic labs to calculate statistical frequencies for DNA test results since the late 1990s. In response to this, the Texas Forensic Science Commission, who were concerned that some labs were still using outdated protocols for interpreting DNA mixtures, issued a letter urging labs to adopt more current and scientifically sound methods for interpreting DNA mixtures. As labs across Texas updated their protocols, the APD DNA lab refused to make these changes. The lab's DNA supervisor at the time was Jeff Salas, and he had little experience performing casework and very little understanding of DNA interpretation. Jeff sent a series of emails criticizing the TFSC for their letter, and he seemed more concerned with lab analysts losing their careers and being blindsided by new rules than with the impact that using outdated protocols would have. What's even more concerning is that the previous DNA supervisor, who was in charge of the lab when the DNA testing was conducted in Areli's case, was even more incompetent and had even less expertise and knowledge than Jeff. And this individual signed off on scientifically flawed validation studies for DNA mixture interpretation. William Bill Gibbons, who served as the laboratory director for the entire forensic science division from 2002 to 2017, did not even have a college degree and had no scientific background at all. He admitted that the lab's quality assurance system was lacking and that the DNA section was allowed to manage its own quality assurance internally with little oversight. For years, the lab had no formal process for notifying staff of quality issues or implementing corrective actions. This persisted despite audit findings in 2008 and 2009 that showed several lab sections, including the crime scene and latent print sections, failed to follow standard procedures for technical reviews. On February 27, 2015, Jeff stated that in the lab, corrective actions were often seen in a negative light, treated more like punishments than opportunities for improvement. Documenting errors was viewed as a personal attack rather than a way to learn and grow from mistakes. Elizabeth Morris explained the poor documentation practices in the lab and said that if there was a disagreement between an analyst and a technical reviewer about how to interpret DNA results, it wouldn't be recorded in the case file. Instead, the final decision would be made by the technical leader, Cassie Carradine, without any official documentation of the differing opinions. Meanwhile, the Travis County District Attorney's Office, which had prosecuted Areli, asked for help from Dr. Bruce Buddall. He is a renowned DNA expert who was helping TFSC in reviewing the state's publicly funded labs. Dr. Buddall was tasked with reviewing the DNA testing and interpretations conducted by the APD lab in several criminal cases, including Areli's. His independent analysis raised serious concerns about the reliability of the lab's results. Dr. Buddall's review of the APD lab's methods revealed major flaws, particularly in how they interpreted DNA mixtures. Despite being alerted to these issues, the lab staff still refused to reinterpret DNA mixtures to account for updated interpretation methods. In fact, Elizabeth, who had worked on Areli's case, continued to defend the lab's outdated methods even after being shown that those protocols were scientifically unsound. It was also revealed that she wasn't properly qualified for the work she was doing. Based on this, the TFSC conducted an on-site audit in May and June of 2016. While the audit was initially intended to focus solely on the interpretation methods, the TFSC auditors uncovered even more problems. The APD lab was found to have failed to follow scientifically accepted practices and demonstrated a pattern of bias in its work. The lab was also suspected of causing serious contamination in numerous cases, yet these issues went undetected due to failures in quality control. As early as 2009, the Travis County DA's office had raised concerns about potential contamination with the APD lab. However, the lab failed to take any action to document or investigate the issue. When the audit team questioned Diana Morales about what should be done to address a contamination issue in a sexual assault case, which we will detail later on, she mentioned that she would deal with it when it was time to testify, and just explained to the court that there was a possibility of contamination. Both Elizabeth and Diana, who worked on Areli's case, were personally involved in multiple contamination incidents, which we will also detail later on in the video. In 2010, former APD DNA analyst Cecily Hamilton filed an internal complaint, alleging that DNA contamination had occurred in the lab, and that Cassie Carradine was inconsistent when addressing technical errors in casework. She also alleged that Cassie had helped Diana cheat on a competency exam, and that Diana was not qualified for her role. However, APD handled the complaint poorly, treating it mostly as a personal or human resources issue, rather than addressing it as a potential sign of systemic failures in the lab's policies and practices. Auditors also found that the lab had a cavalier attitude toward performing sound forensic analyses, and that its DNA analysts lacked a fundamental understanding of quality assurance procedures, and some of them even had to be trained on basic issues. The lab's leadership was also criticized for lacking the scientific and technical knowledge to properly lead the lab. As a result of the TFSC's audit, the APD lab lost its accreditation and was temporarily shut down. To address the fallout, the City of Austin and Travis County came up with a two-part plan. The first part involved a review of past cases that might have been impacted by the lab's work, with a collaborative effort between the Public Defender's Office and the Travis County District Attorney's Office. The second part aimed to retrain the lab's DNA analysts and re-examine past work, particularly the cases handled by Diana. In August 2016, training was initiated to address the issues at the lab, primarily conducted by Caitlin Lott, the lead trainer at Austin's Department of Public Safety lab. However, the retraining initiative was short-lived. The senior DNA analysts at APD, including ones who worked on Areli's case, were highly resistant to the new methods and refused to learn the updated interpretation methods. They refused to accept responsibility for their mistakes and were unwilling to learn. Once, Caitlin instructed Elizabeth on how to properly use decappers, tools designed to minimize contamination, but she refused to use them for the rest of the training. She was even using expired reagents. When instructed that analysts should not screen evidence on the same bench at the same time, a standard designed to reduce contamination risks, Diana argued that it wasn't feasible to comply with the requirement. The training had originally been planned to begin with serology and end with DNA analysis, but due to the APD analyst's inability to successfully complete the serology portion, the entire training was stopped before any DNA training could even take place. Consequently, the analysts were not allowed to perform forensic work or case analysis, as the state decided that they could not be retrained, and the lab was permanently closed. Further investigations into the lab revealed that the issues found in the audit may have only been the tip of the iceberg. The problems at the lab went far beyond just faulty testing methods. There were also concerns about the handling of evidence, including questionable practices in order to squeeze data out of samples that otherwise might not have been interpretable. It was also discovered that there was a freezer malfunction that compromised crucial DNA evidence. In March 2016, just before the TFSC audit, a freezer that stored hundreds of DNA samples malfunctioned, going without proper cooling for almost a full week. Despite the potential risks to the integrity of the samples, Diana, who was the interim technical leader at the time, made the decision to keep it a secret and did not notify anyone. She claimed that there was no way to determine if any samples had been compromised. The public didn't learn about the freezer breakdown until the fall of 2016, when it was revealed during cross-examination in a sexual assault trial. After the freezer malfunction incident, the only corrective action taken was that Cassie supervised Diana's extraction process in another case, offering some basic guidance like glove tips, since she had a habit of touching her gloves too frequently. When questioned about how she opened tubes, Diana explained that she used her fingertip instead of a tool, because she was afraid of not being able to see what she was touching with the tool. This explanation didn't make much sense. In another case, Elizabeth had to be repeatedly reminded to wear gloves properly. In an interview with the Quattrone Center, She admitted she didn't even think about how using gloves that were too large might affect her work. Her performance was so concerning that she was placed on a performance improvement plan from August 2007 to August 2008, after multiple contamination incidents in a short period of time. Despite this intervention, contamination issues persisted for years. We will now go into how these issues severely compromised the forensic evidence in Areli's case. Professor Keith Inman conducted a detailed review of APD's practices, specifically about how evidence was discovered, collected, preserved, and transported within the larger forensic science division. Several red flags were identified in the chain of custody and the handling of the evidence, even before it reached the DNA section in Areli's case, and there were multiple opportunities for contamination. In December 2009, shortly after APD completed DNA testing, an evidence package which had been in Elizabeth's possession was found to have a broken seal. When this was pointed out to her, she showed no urgency or concern in correcting the issue. There was also evidence of potential tampering with the seals on multiple evidence packages. Additionally, at least 2 employees who handled key evidence had serious disciplinary issues related to proper evidence handling. One of the employees who handled evidence in Areli's case, Fred Powell, a former evidence control specialist, was responsible for handling several key pieces of evidence, including the piece of carpet from Bianca's apartment with a bloodied shoe print. Fred had several documented disciplinary and work performance issues, including mislabeling evidence, improperly sealing it, losing it, and even intentionally damaging evidence. In one instance, he was cited for drinking while on the job. In another, he lost seized narcotics and failed to report the incident. There was even an occasion when Fred threw a rape kit in anger. Despite these serious violations that could have compromised evidence integrity, management continued to assign him to handle sensitive evidence. Similarly, another individual with a questionable track record was former crime scene specialist Stacy Wells. She was responsible for collecting critical evidence from both Areli's apartment and his mother's house. Stacy had a history of mishandling and improperly packaging crime scene evidence. In December 2008, she was reprimanded for bringing in unlabeled, open, and unsecured evidence bags into the crime lab. This could have led to spills, contamination, or even the complete loss of evidence. In July 2009, she failed to properly label evidence. Multiple bags had to be opened to identify the contents, and one bag didn't have any identifying information at all. Like Fred, Stacy continued to be entrusted with handling vital evidence despite her history. Eventually, she resigned after it was discovered that she had falsified her qualifications on her employment application and lied under oath in court. Beyond individual failures, there were also significant concerns about the physical evidence in this case, particularly the handling and storage of crime scene items. On May 31, 2009, crime scene specialist Jennifer Mazzei collected over a dozen items from Bianca's apartment, including several that were soaked in blood. According to the documentation, she brought the items to the APD Forensics Center and stored them in Drying Room G. The crime scene lab's standard operating procedures required that wet items be placed on clean butcher paper and covered with dry paper to prevent contamination. However, Jennifer's notes only mentioned placing the wet items on butcher paper, without any indication that they were properly covered. Even after blood dries, bloody items must remain covered, because blood dust, which is blood that flakes off in extremely small quantities, can still pose a contamination risk. On June 2, 2009, crime scene specialist Ian Farrell entered Drying Room G using a master key to collect evidence for transfer to another section. Ian documented his entry. However, the documentation also shows that on June 3rd, while the blood-soaked items from Bianca's apartment were still stored in Drying Room G, there was evidence of a potential risk for cross-contamination. According to the SOPs, it's important that evidence from different crime scenes be stored separately to avoid any possibility of contamination. But it appeared that evidence from multiple scenes was being stored in the same drying room. When Stacy entered and stored the evidence she collected from Areli's mother's residence, including 2 large sofa cushion covers, she placed them in the same drying room as other evidence from the crime scene. On June 4, 2009, Stacy retrieved the evidence she had stored the day before, then sealed, signed, and submitted it to the central evidence locker. But on the same day, she also retrieved another set of evidence from Areli's apartment. These items, which included the polo shoes and jeans, were handled while Stacy was still in possession of the items from Areli's mother's home. There's no documentation that Stacy took any measures to prevent cross-contamination between these different sets of evidence. By June 2009, at least 3 different crime scenes were being stored in the same drying room, further increasing the chances of contamination. Sharing a drying room between evidence from multiple crime scenes, especially one containing bloody evidence, poses an even greater risk for cross-contamination. There were also serious concerns about the quality assurance system at Fairfax Identity Laboratories. A key mistake occurred when Marisa Rowe mishandled several key samples, the ones from the polo shoes, Nautica shirt, and front doorknob lock. She had misplaced the samples while preparing them for testing. After running the samples, she saw strange data in the negative control, which should have shown no data at all. Upon further investigation, she realized she'd mislaid the samples in the wrong tray. Rather than rerun the entire batch to correct the error, she decided to only retest some of the samples. Another major issue was that the APD Forensic Science Division was responsible for initially collecting, packaging, and storing all the evidence in the case. Since the DNA testing was done at Fairfax Identity Laboratories, but the samples had passed through APD's hands first, it was concluded that the reliability of the results was compromised across the board. Dr. Crane, an expert in forensic DNA, likened it to pollution in a river, saying that even if Fairfax's analysis was sound, the potential for contamination from earlier handling made the final results less reliable. Additionally, the TFSC audit team reviewed DNA testing in another case, where there was a concern about potential contamination of the victim's DNA sample to the penile swab of a person of interest. It was discovered that Diana, who worked on Areli's case, placed the victim's DNA sample, which had a very high concentration of DNA, right next to the penile swab that contained a much lower DNA concentration, throughout the entire testing process. At least since the mid-1990s, it's been understood in the forensic community that DNA-rich samples should never be placed next to samples with low DNA concentrations. It's also critical that crime scene samples be kept separate from samples from a person of interest. It was then concluded that carryover contamination likely occurred due to a mishandling of evidence. In Areli's case, it was concluded that, quote, specific issues identified with respect to the manner in which the evidence in Areli's case was collected, stored, and handled at various stages of the process provide further reason to question the overall reliability of the DNA results in this case. Additionally, the court also concluded that Dr. Mitchell Holland and Elizabeth misled the jury into believing that the APD lab's accreditation meant that they followed strict scientific protocols. On December 14, 2015, in response to issues raised by the TFSC, APD issued a supplemental report indicating that the results for several DNA samples in Areli's case needed correction. Emails from November 19, 2009, between Cassie Carradine, who was then the supervisor and technical leader of the APD lab, and Brady Mills, who was then the assistant laboratory director of the DPS, were also a part of the investigation. These emails revealed that the lab's testing strategy was influenced by irrelevant case details, including the prosecution's unproven theory of guilt. For example, Cassie wrote, quote, "This is a true stranger murder. A teenage girl and her baby were at her family's home, and this guy, who lived nearby but was not known to the victim, gained entry and seriously injured her child and murdered her. He became a suspect because his girlfriend had called him while he was attacking the victim, and she heard a girl screaming. She called the police and things were put together. We could not get his DNA on any crime scene evidence above threshold. There was a lot of her blood everywhere, but there are a couple of samples where Elizabeth believes his profile is below threshold, one being the deadbolt on the front door. We have her DNA on shoes believed to be his, but I think they really want to be able to put him at the scene, so he can't say someone else was wearing the shoes. It was really a very brutal murder of a completely innocent victim," unquote. These emails suggested that APD's testing strategy, particularly in Areli's case, was influenced by information that should never have been considered, as this kind of information shared between lab personnel and prosecutors could bias the analysis. Scientific studies have shown that when DNA examiners are exposed to irrelevant contextual details about a case, they're more likely to include a suspect's DNA in a mixture, even when the evidence is inconclusive. It was concluded that this was a clear violation of forensic standards, as outlined by the National Commission on Forensic Science, which advises against letting any case information influence the objectivity of forensic analysis. Another important piece of evidence in the case was the fingerprint found on a lotion bottle near Bianca's body, which was initially excluded from matching Areli by Sandy Siegel, and this was later verified by her supervisor. However, during the trial, a re-examination of this fingerprint was conducted over the weekend of May 8th and 9th, 2011. Assistant District Attorney Allison Wetzel asks Sandy to re-examine the print, believing that the prints were a match, which led to her reversing her original finding without explaining what had changed her analysis. Despite this, Sandy testified under cross-examination that the fingerprint was a low-quality print, making it difficult to draw firm conclusions. Nevertheless, in closing arguments, the prosecution told the jury that expert testimony confirmed a match. Sandy seemed determined to identify a match, even if it wasn't entirely clear. She openly admitted this, saying, quote, "I had an open latent print, and I was trying to find who it belonged to." Given the significance of the fingerprint evidence in the case, Sandy and Assistant District Attorney Allison Wetzel both knew that failing to match the print to someone would be detrimental to the prosecution's case. This kind of situation is a classic example of confirmation bias, and it was concluded that it didn't meet modern standards for forensic analysis. Another crucial piece of evidence was the shoe print found at the crime scene, which allegedly matched Areli's shoe. But the tread design of that shoe was common to thousands of shoes in the Austin area, and shoe print evidence, like bite mark evidence, has been called into question in recent years, and this evidence was considered unreliable. The prosecution also presented cell tower data through two witnesses, Belinda Owens from Sprint and Sheila Hargis from APD. Belinda, who admitted she wasn't a physicist or engineer, claimed to have general knowledge about cell towers based on training she received during her time at Sprint. She explained that cell towers are always going to know where that phone is coming from when it makes or receives a call, and that the cell tower data was consistent with Areli being in Bianca's apartment at the time of the murder. However, during an evidentiary hearing held in 2018, Areli called on Gerald R. Grant, an expert in digital forensics and historical cell site analysis, to challenge this interpretation. With over 30 years of experience in the field, he provided a crucial insight. Historical cell site data can't pinpoint a phone's exact location, only its general area. He also said that there was also a lot of crucial data which was missing during the trial, and without this missing data, concrete conclusions about the phone's precise location during those calls could not have been made. Revised analysis of the evidence used in the trial revealed extreme inconsistencies. First, the profile obtained from a stain on Areli's Nautica shirt was insufficient to interpret, and the results were inconclusive. Similarly, the DNA profile from another stain on the same shirt was inadequate for comparison to known samples. Lastly, the analysis of the shirt showed a mixed profile of at least 3 contributors, but the results were also deemed inadequate for comparison. When it came to a stain from the right polo shoe and another one from the left shoe, it was found that the lab's CPI calculations were scientifically flawed. Another issue with the case comes from Marissa's analysis of samples from the Mazda, which was compromised by the fact that she was exposed to irrelevant case information before even starting her work. In emails between her and Assistant District Attorney Wetzel, it was revealed that the prosecution had shared their unproven theory about the Mazda, including that Areli had driven the vehicle from the crime scene to his friend's house. Being aware of such details before she analyzed the samples created a potential bias in Marissa's work, which raised serious concerns about the integrity of her analysis. The Mazda car samples, which were the only samples that hadn't been previously tested by APD, were now considered inconclusive. Areli's attorneys, Alan Williams and Steve Britton, testified in affidavits about how this new evidence regarding the APD lab would have impacted their defense strategy. They said that given what they now know about the closure of the lab and the removal of Diana and Elizabeth from all lab work, they would have moved to preclude all DNA evidence produced by the lab through all available legal means. The Supreme Court believed that if the defense had pursued the strategy of excluding DNA evidence, they likely would have been successful. Without the DNA results, combined with the issues with other forensic evidence, the prosecution's case would have been heavily weakened, and the rest of the case presented by the prosecution would not have been enough to convince the jury that Areli was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. It was concluded that all DNA evidence connected to APD was unreliable, and that specific issues identified with regard to APD's handling and testing of the DNA evidence in Areli's case further undermine the reliability of the DNA results in this case. In 2020, the Travis County District Court recommended that Areli Escobar's conviction for the 2009 rape and murder of Bianca Maldonado be overturned. The court determined that his conviction was largely based on DNA evidence from the Austin Police Department's crime lab, which is scientifically questionable. Travis County District Attorney José Garza took office in 2021, and he decided to review Areli's conviction. After looking into the case, DA Garza agreed that the evidence the jury relied on was inaccurate and misleading, and his office supported a new trial for Areli. However, despite the state agreeing with Areli's stance that the evidence used against him was questionable, and the district court also concluding that false DNA evidence likely affected the judgment of the jury, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals denied his request for relief in 2022 without offering much of an explanation. In a brief filed by Areli's attorney, he argued that the Court of Criminal Appeals had overstepped its bounds by upholding a conviction that even the prosecution no longer supported. DA Garza was so baffled by the decision that he filed a petition to clarify his position, asking for further review and a new opinion, but the court denied his request. Areli then appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the American Bar Association filed an amicus brief in support. On January 9, 2023, the Supreme Court vacated the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals ruling and sent the case back for further review. But when the Texas court reconsidered the case, it again denied Areli relief, prompting him to petition the Supreme Court once more. The American Bar Association filed a second brief, pointing out that the Texas court had ignored the state's confession of error and failed to provide any substantial reasoning for keeping Areli's conviction intact. According to the New York Times, the Supreme Court may hear the case again after Areli's lawyers asked the court to intervene in February of 2024. At the time of recording this video, Areli Escobar has spent about 14 years on death row. He remains there to this day. Thank you for watching.